So, if you've ever been a little bit afraid of doing a Fair Isle sweater because it involves a steek, there's nothing to fear. I'm actually just about to finish my sweater, and I can't wait to cut the steeks. It's actually my favorite part. That might sound a little bit crazy to you because, I think the concept of cutting your knitting sounds a little bit scary. But when you think about it, once you've prepared your steeks in the proper way and cut all the way through all the pieces of yarn that are separating you from actually wearing your garment, it's like you're finally freeing whatever you're going to wear from its knitted cage. So I'll finally be able to put my arm through that hole. I can finally put my neck through this one. It's a really fun thing to do once you get good at it. So I'm going to show you the way to prepare a steek and cut a steek with no fear involved. So first of all, what is a steek? A steek is a small strip of knitted fabric that separates two parts of something done in colorwork that are going to be separated eventually. So in this case, this is actually two sleeves that are knit together. It actually helps to preserve the gauge of the sleeve cap when they're knit like this, instead of knitting each one separately in a small round or knitting it back and forth in Fair Isle. So I always put a steek between each side of a sleeve cap. And it also separates things like, this is where the zipper is going to be installed on the front of my sweater. The collar actually had been steeked, and obviously the arm size are steeked as well. So this little piece of knitted fabric is extra stitches that are cast on, and they're put in place with the express purpose of being cut apart. So you don't actually have to worry about cutting into your patterning or anything like that. You basically completely ignore this section when you're reading from a chart or anything like that. In this case, it's 7 stitches, and that's a general size of steek that I like to use. I think it gives a lot of latitude for where you want to cut and how much extra fluff you end up with on the inside. So now I've already cut the center steek here, and you can see what happens. That basically this part used to go all the way across. It was 7 stitches, and I cut down the middle. And really you can see that nothing is happening here. It just sort of folds under on itself. That's just the general nature of stockinette stitch. And it'll just lay there indefinitely. And this is wool the Andes, so it is 100% wool, which is, if you haven't steeked before, I would definitely start with 100% wool. Because it's going to felt up a little bit, and especially after you've worn the garment a while, all these little ends are going to start to fuse together, especially in the arm size and anywhere that the garment gets a lot of wear. So you won't have to worry about anything unraveling. But the way that this is sewn will also prevent that. So that's what I'm going to show you today. Now these steeks have already been prepared. What they have is a running stitch that goes up, and then a back stitch going down. So, and you can do that in any direction, it doesn't matter. But basically, it just matters that you have 2 lines of sewing on either side of the place that you're going to cut. Now, in this case, it's, a 7-stitch steek, and there's 3 stitches in the middle. So I have a little bit more latitude for cutting if I accidentally go over one side a little too much. It doesn't matter. You can also place your seams closer together. In this case, it's just around the center. And so this is going to maintain a much stiffer edge. I generally like to do things that are a little bit farther out, because then again, it does give that the extra bit of fluff here that will probably felt to itself. Or, you do have the room, if you have a needle felting needle, to actually kind of pre-felt your steek together before you cut it open, or even afterwards. Now, if you are using something like a cotton, if you're allergic to wools, or if you just aren't using an animal fiber, something that's going to stick to itself, you still can steek any other material. You just have to take the proper precautions. And one of those, especially with something like cotton, is that it is a very slippery yarn comparatively. So you're not going to be able to have as narrow a steek. You're going to want to give yourself a little bit more room to cut that open, and you're going to want to sew in a slightly different way. And as I'm sewing, I'll kind of describe to you what you need to do in the case of cottons and other things. I have steeked things like cotton before, and it was in the case of a table linen. So where that actually folded over, you just sort of glue along the edge, and it really doesn't make any difference. And also, if the area that you're steeking doesn't need to be stretchy, in this case this doesn't, it's going to have a zipper installed anyway. There's also wonderful, there's a material called stitch witchery, which is basically a hem tape, and it's this fusible hem binding that you would lay it down across your steek and put like a little piece of ribbon, grosgrain ribbon or something, and you just iron them together, and it'll just keep it stiff and safe. You wouldn't want to do that on an arm side because you do want stretch here. So you just have to be very mindful of the placement in using any sort of extra materials around your steeks. So without further ado, we're going to steek some sleeves. So as you can see, there's the 7 stitches here, and I just do them in a checkerboard that gives the best length to the floats. I think they're tacked a lot better that way. Another thing I do with steeks, which is really nice, is, you know, occasionally, especially when you've got a lot of decreases, sometimes you can have a little bit of extra yarn showing up, and so you just kind of use your knitting needle and pick that through to the center of the steek and just pull the extra yarn through. You'll just end up cutting that off, so you don't have to worry about it. And the same thing with if you're changing colors. You'll always want to change your colors in the middle of a steek, that way you don't have to weave your ends in. So I would choose a yarn that matches whatever yarn you've used in terms of fiber content, not necessarily color. I do like the bright colors because it's easier to see if something's coming undone later. And if your steeks are showing, you're doing it wrong, so you don't have to worry about it showing up on the right side of the garment. So you just choose, you take a piece of yarn, in this case it's pallet. It's the same fiber content as wool of the Andes, but it is much finer, so it's a lot easier to use in terms of steeking. Of course, pallet on pallet works great. Pallet on any other wool yarn works great. And it comes in such bright colors that it's easy to find. Now, I wouldn't use anything that was cotton or nylon for this because, as you can see, the wool has a bit of a stretch to it. And again, you're going to want a lot of these steeks to have a bit of stretch. So the problem that you get with nylons and other sorts of sewing thread is that they do tend to be very stiff. Now, the place where you're actually going to want to use that is in cottons, because you're going to want to kind of counteract the stretchiness of that, and you also don't want the wool and cotton together. So to start this, got my center stitch here, going to move over 1 stitch and stitch into the second one in from the side of the steek. And I'm using a very sharp needle, and that's very important because you want to pierce through every single strand of yarn. I'm just going to do a running stitch. So I went in through the first stitch, out through the second stitch, in through the third, out through the fourth. And this is just kind of a way to make sure you've got everything lined up. You can just sew through as many as you want all at once. And when we come back down and do the running stitch, it's going to be through the same stitch, but on the other side of it. So essentially, what you end up with is that both sides of this stitch are going to be sewn down. And the running stitch is good because it allows you to test your stretch. And if anything were to happen where you've accidentally done your back stitch too tight and it ends up popping, you know, if you wear your sweater a lot and all of a sudden that comes out, you'll still have a running stitch in there, which will stretch and allow you enough time to repair the other part of the steek. So now once you get to the top of any particular steek, and yes, you will be cutting through a bind off, most likely, you literally just come back down the other side, go through the first stitch, the second stitch, and now we start back stitching. So what happens here, essentially, you go, come out here, I'm going to sew back down through the stitch above and come out the stitch below. What's really important about the back stitch is that you are crossing over yourself. So as you can see where one stitch came out, the other stitch is on either side of it. So it doesn't matter if you have little blips on one side. That's essentially what it'll look like from the wrong side if you're doing it this way, as long as you are sewing on either side of the previous stitch. And the reason for that is stability, because this will not pull out like the running stitch can. So when your last stitch has come out through one of these stitches, you always want to sew your next stitch in through the stitch above, out through the stitch below. So you end up with the new stitch on either side of where the old stitch came out. This one's coming out here, go through the stitch above, come out the stitch below. So once you've prepared your steek, all that's left is to cut. Now, all you need is a pair of very sharp scissors. You do not require any sort of alcoholic substances, unlike some folks might tell you. You don't need to take any deep breaths. This is actually really, really simple. It's like cutting paper, like cutting fabric, like anything else. So we do have steeking scissors. They're very sharp, so you want to be careful, but they're a very short blade, which is good because you don't want to go too far too fast because you can get ahead of yourself, especially considering you're going to be cutting through a bunch of different floats and things as well, and you want to make sure you really get through all layers of that fabric. So you just start in the center, right in the center of the center stitch, and you just begin to cut. And just take a little at a time, and my hand is in here to kind of separate the pieces of knitting once they are cut apart. That way I know that I've actually gone through all the layers. And it also keeps me from accidentally cutting through something that I don't intend to. And so then you just come out the other end. All of a sudden, there's an arm side. And look, nothing unraveling, nothing's going anywhere. It just stays exactly as it's cut. And as soon as the sleeve is sewn in, these pieces will stay just like that indefinitely. Now, when you do sew things together that have steeks, one good thing to do is actually to take the yarn that you're using to stitch your sleeve in and just run it again through the steeks, just to kind of further the solidity of that steeked edge. But really, that's all there is to it. It's not going to go anywhere as long as it's been properly sewn, and it's going to last as long as you want to wear the garment, because wool is kind of a magical thing. Now, again, when you have something like cotton or another fabric, you're going to want to put something over that steeked edge, whether it be ribbon, or in the case of wanting something stretchy, you might just want to sew a piece of bias tape over the edge of your steek, and that will keep it from fraying too much. It'll also keep it stretchy, which will be really nice. Now, I have heard of people sewing their steeks on a sewing machine, but one thing you can tell when you actually look at knitted fabric is it's very, very thick, and you've got these big stitches, and you also need a stretch. And all of those things are a little bit daunting to a sewing machine, especially if it's just a basic machine and it isn't really intended for use on heavier garments and things like that. One of the problems that you might run into is that these floats will actually catch on the feed dogs on the sewing machine, and it gets all gnarly after that. And then you end up with a very, very stiff sewn edge. I mean, it's not going anywhere, but it's incredibly stiff. So that's okay if you want to do something like that, where you're going to be installing a zipper, like in this case. or someplace where it's you know, maybe a laptop bag or something that really does need to be sturdy. But again, any place where you're going to be moving around, in this case, have your arm through here, you don't want that stiffness or you're going to regret it. So you want to make sure that it's sewn nice and loose. If you're using a cotton or even when you're using wool and you want to reinforce it, you use something that's going to match the stretch of the fabric itself. And all that's left then is just to sew the pieces together, wear it, and enjoy.